The Forgotten Room. In the heart of the city, hidden beneath layers of urban decay, there was an old abandoned apartment building known only to the most desperate or those lost to society's fringes. They called it the Last Stop. It was here, in apartment 3C, where the legend of the Forgotten Room was born. Elijah, a washed-up journalist looking for a story to reignite his career, heard whispers of this place. They said that once you entered apartment 3C, you might never leave, not because you couldn't, but because something in there made you want to stay. Or perhaps it wouldn't let you go. Driven by a mix of curiosity and desperation, Elijah decided to investigate. The door to 3C was unremarkable, save for the deep scratches that marred its surface like desperate claw marks. Inside, the air was thick with the stench of mold and something metallic like old blood. The room was dimly lit by a flickering bulb, revealing walls covered in what looked like frenzied writings and symbols, some in languages long dead. But it was the center of the room that drew Elijah's gaze. A large, rusted iron bed frame with restraints, stained dark with what he hoped wasn't what he thought it was. As he stepped closer, the temperature dropped. That's when he noticed the photographs. Hundreds of Polaroids were scattered around, each showing faces twisted in terror, or blank with a dead stare, all taken in this very room. Elijah's heart raced as he picked one up. The face was almost unrecognizable, but the eyes, they seemed to plead for help. Then, a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind, but the words were clear.
"Stay with us."
The bulb flickered out, plunging the room into darkness. Panic set in, but as Elijah fumbled for his flashlight, he felt something cold brush against his hand. The flashlight beam, when it finally came on, revealed nothing but the empty room. Yet, the feeling of being watched intensified. He decided to leave, but as he turned, the door slammed shut with a force that shook the dust from the ceiling. The temperature plummeted further, and now, whispers filled the room, overlapping, growing louder, some begging for release, others hissing threats. Elijah's flashlight began to die, its light dimming, and in those last flickers he saw them, the figures from the photos standing, watching him with hollow eyes. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones, their mouths agape in silent screams or twisted smiles. He felt hands, cold and numerous, grabbing at him, pulling him towards the bed. The restraints, which had looked old and brittle, now moved like they were alive, wrapping around his wrists and ankles with a strength that belied their rusted appearance. Elijah's mind raced as the cold skeletal fingers began to tear at his clothes, the fabric ripping with a sound that echoed like screams in the confined space. The room, now alive with spectral figures, seemed to pulse with an evil energy. One of them, a woman with hollow sockets where eyes should have been, whispered in a voice like dry leaves.
"Let's see what's inside."
The rusted restraints tightened further, cutting into Elijah's skin, drawing blood that seemed to seep into the metal, rejuvenating it. Then came the tools, antique, surgical in appearance but barbaric in design, laid out on a tray that materialized from the shadows. The first incision was made by a figure whose fingers ended in scalpel-like nails. It was slow, deliberate, slicing through Elijah's abdomen. He screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the room, absorbed into its walls. The pain was unimaginable, a white-hot agony that should have rendered him unconscious, but some dark force kept him awake, aware of every cut, every exploration into his flesh. They pulled back skin and muscle with cold, precise movements, exposing his insides. Another spectre, this one with a face half-eaten by decay, leaned in with what looked like a rusted spoon, scooping, examining, as if curious about the human anatomy. Elijah could see his own organs, pulsating, the figures taking turns to touch, to prod, some even tasting. His mind, unable to cope, began to fracture. His screams turned to laughter, then to whimpers as they stitched him back together with coarse thread, only to start anew, exploring different parts, different ways to inflict pain. They whispered to him tales of their own demise, each story more horrific than the last, each death reenacted upon him in some twisted form. One spectre, with a neck bent at an unnatural angle, demonstrated how it was strangled, tightening an invisible noose around Elijah's throat, letting him feel the brink of asphyxiation over and over. His fingers were bent back until they snapped, each break accompanied by the spectral audience's applause. His eyes they left for last, discussing in detached tones how they would preserve them to keep him seeing, even in death. When they finally decided to end his suffering, it was not out of mercy but because dawn approached. They used a dull blade, drawing it across his throat, the pain dulled by his already shattered psyche. As life ebbed from him, the room returned to silence. The figures faded back into the walls as the light crept into the room. Elijah's mind broke. He was now part of the room, his screams joining the chorus of whispers. The camera somehow clicked, capturing his terror. The next day, the door to 3C was found ajar, the room empty except for an additional Polaroid on the floor, showing Elijah's face, now part of the collection, forever a part of the forgotten room.
Bloody Mary.